saw from the original publicity, we are amidst 6 weeks in the Revised Common Lectionary in the book of Ephesians for the epistle reading each Sunday. And so this seemed like a good time to revisit some material in this epistle, which really has captured my attention now for more than 30 years. I first did work in the book of Ephesians back in the late 1970s and have tried to dip into it on a regular basis ever since. And so what I want to do is try to give an overview of Ephesians as a manifesto of Christian peacemaking, concentrating on the 6 texts that actually come up in the lectionary. As you know, lectionaries are a little inconsistent in terms of how they, the bits and pieces of Scripture that actually get in, and Ephesians has been rather roughly treated in some cases. So we really only have 6 core samples over these weeks, but we're going to do our best to try to keep the whole in mind as well as the parts. So I'm going to go ahead and begin. Obviously, those of you on this webinar, you're all involved in some degree in peace and justice work. You're all well aware that we live in a world that is divided, that is defined by dividing walls. And these walls are the expression of the social architecture of enmity and inequality. In the past, these expressions have included the cultural walls of racial apartheid, as well as the political barriers of Cold War hostility, and now increasingly the war between North and South. It seems like in our world, no sooner does one wall come down than another wall goes up. The book of Ephesians very directly addresses the phenomenon of enmity and of walls. Just get my attention if I'm missing somebody who's trying to get in. You see those little signs come up? Okay. Because if I'm concentrating, I might miss it.
Underneath is here.
Yes. In the middle part of the 20th century, the epistle to the Ephesians, with its emphasis on peace and overcoming division, was a favorite text of 3 notable social movements. International ecumenism, it was one of the theme texts of the founding of the World Council of Churches, was one. The Cold War disarmament movement was another, and the civil rights movement was a third. Biblical scholar Marcus Barth, the son of the great Karl Barth, wrote during the darkest days of the Cold War, "If Christ is peace, then Christ is by nature a social, even a political event, which marks the overcoming and ending of barriers, however deeply founded and highly constructed. When this peace is deprived of its social, national, or economic dimensions, then Jesus Christ is being flatly denied." It's a very powerful trope about Ephesians and about our world. However, in the last 40 years, Ephesians has fallen into disfavor in mainstream Christian circles and is sometimes avoided today. I believe that the central character, however, of this epistle as a manifesto of peacemaking is too important to ignore. And so this webinar is part of an effort to reclaim the book of Ephesians. So we're going to do some Bible study tonight. I'm really happy that you've all joined our webinar. We're hoping these webinars can, for some of you, serve as a monthly Bible study or theological reflection. And in the future, feel free to invite others to share a communal experience of watching these webinars. And if any of you are actually watching with other people, you might just chat that, and Charlita will keep track of that. Ephesians probably dates from the late 1st century, and I believe it was authored by someone or a group who belonged to a Pauline school. the author takes on the task of summarizing the social character of the apostles' theology for a new generation of Christians, a quarter century or more after Paul's death. Though tradition attached this letter to the city of Ephesus, it probably was a circular letter being sent around to all the churches throughout Asia Minor. Indeed, if you look at a map of the ancient world, as here, you see that Ephesus is really in the geopolitical middle, roughly halfway between Jerusalem and Rome. And we know that Ephesus was the hub of early Christianity in the region. So I find it helpful to consider Ephesians as really the first encyclical in the history of the church. It was a letter written by disciples of the Apostle Paul to try to clarify his message and its meaning for the next generation. So here we come on the first installment, the first text that actually was the epistle this last Sunday in church on July 15th. The thesis of Ephesians is found in the middle of a long run-on opening prayer. If you have your Bible open in front of you, you'll see that Ephesians 1, 3 to 14, 11 verses, is one single sentence in Greek. It's a long run-on sentence. And I want to just point out several things, and I'm going to have to apologize in advance because we had some formatting problems on the slides that we couldn't resolve before it was time here, so you can't see this too well. But the text is Ephesians 1:8, with all wisdom and insight. The Greek here is Sophia. The author is citing the long Hebrew tradition of Lady Wisdom, in Greek Sophia, upon which this vision of God is predicated. We find Sophia appearing in Proverbs 8. There we're told that Sophia was present at the creation of the world. The Lord by wisdom founded the earth. By understanding, God established the heavens in Proverbs 3. So the idea of Lady Wisdom as coexistent with God is an ancient one for the Hebrews, and it's pretty significant that it is invoked here in this invocation, in this introduction to the epistle, and the term will appear several more times throughout the epistle. Here's the second aspect of the thesis statement here, and that is the notion of the reunification of everything. In verse 9, we're told that God has made known to us the mystery of God's will. This mystery is not an unsolvable one. It is actually a mystery that has been revealed. This theological statement seeks to answer the perennial question of individuals and churches alike. What is God's will for me or for us? And this great cosmic question here receives an answer. It is this. It is the desire to gather up all things in Christ in heaven and on earth. God's desire and intention is the regathering of everything that has been alienated, back into unity through Christ. Nothing less. Notice the phrase, in heaven and on earth, perhaps alluding to the Lord's Prayer. The verb is very interesting here, this gathering up. In Greek, it is anakephalaiosaste, and it appears in only one other place in the New Testament, and that is in Romans 13:9, where Paul says, every commandment is summed up, same word in Greek, in this word, love your neighbor as yourself. So there it means to sum everything up. Here in Ephesians, it means to gather up everything or to reunify. And I use the image here of Humpty Dumpty, or the world as Humpty Dumpty, because I believe that behind this idea is the conviction that the world is shattered, that we are deeply alienated, that everything is in a shambles, shattered into a million pieces. It's a contemporary folk metaphor for what the Bible understands as the fall. And in Ephesians, the idea is that the program of God's dream, God's desire, is to put Humpty back together again, to overcome all division, to include all excluded groups, to heal every wound. The third thing I want to point out about the thesis statement is that Christ, and again I apologize for the formatting, nothing we can do about it right now. Christ is the administrator, and the word in Greek is oikonomion. And that, of course, is the term we get our word economics from. It means literally the management of the household. So to extend the metaphor of Humpty Dumpty shattered, it is truly the case that all the king's horses and all the king's men, especially the king's horses and men, are unable to put Humpty back together again. This kind of great transformation and healing will not and cannot occur from above. Only Christ can manage this task. Another phrase worth noting is that this is not something that's going to happen in the sweet by and by. The time is now. It's the fullness of time, here and now. And you'll notice, those of you who remember the beginning of Mark's gospel will notice that it's a very similar phrase when Jesus appears in Galilee preaching the kingdom of God, saying the time is fulfilled. It's a very dramatic biblical rhetoric to say right here, right now. Now this thesis statement, the healing of the whole world right now, is a remarkably big vision for what was at this time, in the early 2nd or late 1st century, a very small movement that was only 4 generations old. And it raises the uncomfortable question as to whether our big churches nurture only small visions, if this small church could embrace such a huge vision. The fact that the writer repeatedly stresses throughout this epistle that this dream of God is a mystery, but not a secret mystery, testifies to strains of realism that we'll see occur again and again in the book of Ephesians. Because human history has long defied the hope for true cosmic peace. Here, however, the fact that God's dream of reunification of everything has been revealed invites and challenges us to be part of this messianic program. Further now on the thesis statement of Ephesians 1, here's a fourth aspect. It introduces a key theme of the epistle which grounds the cosmic vision of God in the concrete social terrain of the writer. We read the following equation. We, verse 12, and I'm sorry that the highlighting circles are out of kilter, but just try to follow the text. We, in verse 12, plus you, in verse 13, will constitute an us, verse 14. Now this suggests something about the social location of the author. It's clear that the author was Jewish, which is indicated by phrases such as, we who first hoped in Messiah. The audience being addressed, on the other hand, consisted predominantly of non-Jewish Christians who had heard the word of truth and believed. This scenario is further clearly expressed in chapter 2, verse 11. Remember that at one time you Gentiles in the flesh, called the uncircumcision, were separated from Christ, alienated from the commonwealth of Israel, and strangers to the covenants of promise. Ephesians is thus a treatise on the struggle to realize God's great plan of reconciliation in actual history, focusing upon a conflict that at the time of the writer was the central social conflict in antiquity, the conflict between Jews and Gentiles. It's also a conflict between Christ's inauguration of peace and the power's perpetuation of enmity. And at the center of this struggle in history stands the church, which has inherited the messianic vocation of peacemaking. Now, this encyclical reflects concerns, as I mentioned, of a fourth generation ecclesiology, in particular a changing social situation. And I want you to get this because it's very key to Ephesians. As you know, the church started out at the time of Jesus and in the first generations after, including in the time of Paul. It was a predominantly Jewish movement. And Paul and others began to spread the movement beyond the boundaries of first century Judaism. Now, several generations later, that situation is changing. There is now a Gentile majority in the church, and there's a danger that the Jewish roots of the church are going to be forgotten by this emerging majority. This epistle of Ephesians therefore recontextualizes Paul's argument for inclusion that he made in Romans and elsewhere, where he argued that Gentiles must be allowed into the Jewish tradition. Ephesians inverts this argument, urging a predominantly Gentile church not to forget its roots in Judaism and to ensure that a reverse apartheid doesn't occur. Because this is a joint inheritance, it's not just spiritual, but concretely social in character, deeply cultural and political, facing real issues of segregation. The dream of God stands or falls on the creation of a new peoplehood, and that peoplehood will be tested upon the historical fact of human alienation, indeed upon a worst-case example. In Hellenistic antiquity, the cultural, economic, and political conflict between Jew and Gentile was considered to be the prototype of all human hostility. In other words, we're talking about two communities that are in a protracted intergenerational war, not unlike the legacy of American apartheid, or Israeli and Arabs today, or Protestant Unionists and Catholic Republicans in Northern Ireland. The epistle of Ephesians invites Christians today to face the same enmities in our own context. One further thing about the thesis statement of Ephesians that we find in Ephesians 1, and that is the vision, the great vision of Christ as Pantocrator, the sovereign of the cosmos. Here the portrait is of the risen Christ elevated to God's right hand, and there are several noteworthy things here in this conclusion of this opening meditation in Ephesians 1. One is that the resurrection energized or animated a profound new power in the universe, which the rest of this epistle will define as nonviolent resistance, or what activists today call a force more powerful. Another is that Christ is seated, and being seated is an administrative location in an ancient royal court, seated above the principalities and powers. This is a clear statement that Christ's messianic sovereignty eclipses that of every name, especially and including that of the reigning power of the 1st and 2nd century, namely Caesar. A third aspect of this is the way in which the author cites the well-known messianic Psalm 110, in which all things are put under Messiah's feet, another Oriental metaphor. Perhaps we might rather say today, the whole world is in his hands. The author then proceeds to call Christ the head of the church. Now this, unfortunately, has been interpreted, obviously, in a hierarchical fashion through the later course of church history. But the honor and power of a head covering, note the Greek here, kephalen, is related to the previous verb in verse 14, anakephalaio, which means to sum everything up or bring everything together. So today in Palestine we think of the kafia, from the same Greek root, the head covering of Palestinians. So think of Christ as being the head covering of the body, and the author goes on to say finally that the church in fact is the body and the fullness of this vision. Note here the Greek pleroma, the same term that was used earlier in the fullness of time. That is, this peacemaking vision has now come in the fullness of time, and it is the church, which is the fullness of Christ's body, that is going to embody this vision. That's the rather daunting challenge of the book of Ephesians. Now I want to turn to the second piece of Ephesians that comes up in the lectionary, and this is the text that will come up this coming Sunday on July 22nd. It is chapter 2, verses 11 through 22, and you see that it's a concentric structure that you can see from this, the way I've outlined it here. That is, the outer frame, A, repeats a theme, and then the inner frame, B, is an inner frame, and then C is sort of the heart of the theological vision. So what I want to do here is I want to look at each of these three parts of this concentric structure. So let's begin doing that. Here's the first part, the outer frame. The outer frame reflects in explicitly political terms on the notion of citizenship. Note the political terminology here with the Greek root polity, that we're really talking about a political body, or a body politic. The second thing that we see is the emphasis is on those who are outside, specifically labeled as xenoi, from which we get our term xenophobia. These are strangers or foreigners. And the argument of this outer frame is that the outsiders have now been welcomed in, and a new society is being built upon the radical principle of what we would today call open borders. Texts like this really wreak havoc on our modern ideologies of xenophobia, which today particularly discriminate against immigrants. And here now I will, as I will a few times throughout this presentation, shamelessly promote one of our most recent books, which tries to tackle that very question of discrimination against immigrants, called Our God is Undocumented, in which I explore more about this text in Ephesians and its implications for immigrant rights. Now we move to the inner frame, Christ as peacemaker. This is a midrash on Isaiah 57:19. But now in Christ Jesus, you who were once far off have been brought near by the blood of Christ. Christ is our peace. So he came proclaiming peace to you who were far off and peace to those who are near. And you can see the Isaiah text. So you see that clearly this is an allusion to that text. So this is a way of setting this radical principle of open borders as the central strategy of peacemaking. And it's authorized by the prophet Isaiah. And finally, let's get to the heart of Ephesians 2, dismantling the dividing wall. In his flesh, these frames bracket the author's articulation of what transpired on the cross, the great moment of cosmic peacemaking. Isaiah's promise has been realized in the blood of Christ, Ephesians 2:13. Now the author offers a litany of participial clauses stacked on top of each other, as if the author is searching for different ways to communicate this magnificent but somewhat incredible assertion. So, follow. Christ in his flesh has made both groups into one, speaking now very specifically about the concretely socially alienated groups of Jew and Gentile. This is a cultural process of integration and reconciliation. Christ has destroyed the dividing wall of partition, the enmity. This addresses the inner, what we might call the walls in our heads and hearts, the spirituality and psychology of enmity. Also, what happened on the cross is that it annulled the law with its commandments. Notice the Greek word is dogmasin, which we get our term dogmatics from. This is a legal overturning of institutional segregation. You can see why these texts were so important to the civil rights movement. He has also created in himself, as Christ, one new humanity from the two. This is the anthropological project of social reconstruction. And you'll see all of these participial phrases right in this text. Thus, making peace. This is actually a political proclamation that takes immediate effect. It's alluding to the authority of Caesar to proclaim peace and end hostilities. Here, God unilaterally declares peace so that Christ might reconcile us both to God in one body through the cross. That's the theological miracle of reconciliation. More about that in a minute. And then finally, putting to death the enmity in himself. This last phrase returns to the first one. That is, all this has been done in Christ's flesh. Or another way to put it is, Christ has built this bridge on his back. Now, there are two other particularly extraordinary notions articulated in this passage that I want to underline. One is stated in almost Trinitarian fashion. Christ has created in himself one new humanity from the two, reconciling both in one body to God through the cross. For through him, both of us have access to one Spirit, in one Spirit to the Father. So you see the sort of Christ, Spirit, and Creator there. The doctrine of atonement implied here by the order of these assertions is as unambiguous as it is controversial. What the text says is, reconciliation with our ethnic or political enemies is a precondition to reconciliation with God. Now, most of you will recognize that that is often not what the church, in fact, proclaims. Oftentimes our churches say, well, if you just get right with God, then hopefully you'll make peace with your neighbor. Ephesians is very clear that in order for us to be reconciled to God, we have to take two alienated groups, bring them together, and the reunified body is then reconciled to God. God is here portrayed as the originator, not the recipient, of the action of atonement. Moreover, what has been accomplished on the cross is the deconstruction of the preconditions for human enmity. That is, all the laws, all the statutes, all the institutions, all the inner wrong thinking, that has all been deconstructed on the cross, and now we are truly free to be reconciled to each other, and only then to be reconciled together to God. This obviously wreaks havoc on the medieval but still widespread doctrine of substitutionary atonement, namely that Christ's death was designed to placate an angry or offended God. Reconciliation is not something done by Christ to or for God, but rather by God in Christ for the express purpose of human reconciliation. Fortunately, in the last decade, some excellent theological work has been done recovering this New Testament notion of a non-retributive atonement in the work of scholars such as Denny Weaver and New Zealander Christopher Marshall, and I recommend their work highly. Here in Ephesians, we have a portrait of a fundamentally restorative initiative by God, which in another recent book of ours, which obviously did not come up, our Ambassadors of Reconciliation, we portray as central to the practice of restorative justice. So those of you who have Volume 1 of Ambassadors of Reconciliation will find a whole chapter on Ephesians in that book if you want to follow up. Here now is another thing to point out, a second aspect, and that is an image that is fraught with irony. The author of Ephesians claims that the cross, still a symbol in his day of Roman public terrorism, the stake on which all political dissidents were strung up, this executioner stake itself somehow put to death the deep-seated hostilities being outlined. An executioner's cross executing enmity. That's literally what the phrase means. This is somehow trying to get at the profoundly counterintuitive power of nonviolent love, which undoes the power of domination and separation. Peace has been declared, not a sentimental absence of conflict, but a unilateral disarmament for the purpose of genuine reconciliation of adversaries. Literally, a ceasefire, a reconstruction of what it means to be human together. This is the core of the Pauline theology of the cross, which, with no understatement, Ephesians calls repeatedly a mystery. No kidding, it's a mystery. The philosopher René Girard put it well when he said, "The explanatory power of Jesus' death is much greater than we realize, and Paul's exalted idea of the cross as the sword of all knowledge is anthropologically sound." I love that statement of René Girard, and I know that some of you appreciate the writing of Girard. If not, you might find it of interest. I believe this is an important matter for activist theology to wrestle with. Peace and justice folks sometimes fall into the trap of thinking that Jesus merely died as a noble martyr. There is something, however, cosmic that happened in the death of Jesus and in the resurrection of Jesus according to the New Testament. Something that qualitatively changed all human prospects in the world. I'm still partial to the way another esteemed theologian, one of my mentors, James Douglas, put it more than 40 years ago in his classic book, The Nonviolent Cross. Douglas suggests that by embracing the Via Crucis, the way of the cross, Jesus, as the incarnate God, unleashed a new power into the world, the power of nonviolent love. And that is exactly the energizing power that nonviolent activists need if we are going to do our work. Now back to conclude the meditation of Ephesians 2. And that is the beautiful image of the church as an undivided house. There are two parts to this that I want to point out here in verses 19 to 22. The meditation concludes with a description of a new social entity that has been made possible by and in Christ. And this entity is a house, which traditionally in Jewish thought can be seen as both familial and political space. So I want you to note, and hopefully these circles come up correctly. I want you to note all the times that the root oiko, that's the Greek for house or home, appears in these texts. This is a household, but it is a house without walls. The apostles and prophets are the foundation, and Christ Jesus is the keystone. Now, he is not the cornerstone, as it is so often translated, but the keystone, the stone at the top of a Roman arch, literally lying at the extreme angle. The final stone placed at the top of the building structure to integrate it. So, even though this is an architectural metaphor, Christ as the keystone, what we're dealing with here in this household is not a building structure at all. This house is not architectural, it's organic. It's joined sinew to sinew, heart to heart. It is a living body. It's a vision that sounds radical to our ears, since we've all been socialized into accepting political hostility and division as the way the world is. We might even go so far as to say, somewhat analogically, that Ephesians 1 and 2, with its magnificent vision of comprehensive reconciliation, could be compared to Martin Luther King Jr.'s famous "I Have a Dream" speech in 1963, which held out a new social possibility to the United States that rejected racism and embraced a common destiny for white and black into a beloved community. But the rest of the Ephesian encyclical speaks from and to the context of engaged struggle, just as did another piece authored by King in that same year, namely his famous letter from Birmingham City Jail. This is to say, God's dream is not a Pollyannish fantasy, but a social project, which means that real disciples must strategically and nonviolently engage the existing dividing walls, often at real cost. This is another expression of the realism of Ephesians. The true peace church will be persecuted because of its embodied social solidarity. And that's why it should hardly be surprising that the very next thing we see right here in the middle of Ephesians, functioning almost like a fulcrum on which the whole argument of the epistle balances, is a stark reality check to this lofty vision of peace. Because of all this, I, Paul, am a prisoner for Christ on behalf of you Gentiles. Now, here we're at the third installment in the lectionary of Ephesians 3. Unfortunately, the lectionary only includes the second half of Ephesians 3. And I would urge preachers, Weldon, you, and others to embrace the whole of chapter 3, because it's one of the most radically political portions of Scripture we have. So let me fill it out just a little bit here. So just as King had the great I Have a Dream speech only just a few months later to be in jail, so similarly here the vision of Paul is laid out, and then suddenly we encounter Paul sitting in an imperial dungeon. The apostle was locked up by the very laws that supposedly were annulled on Christ's cross. This is a reminder that obviously the abolition of racial hostility was still a vision, not a reality, in the real world of the Roman Empire. We tend to romanticize the terrain in which the New Testament takes place, delude ourselves into thinking that these events all happened in Disneyland. But the social location from which Ephesians proposes its grand vision of peacemaking gives it a distinctive realism. Paul was a political prisoner, a convicted felon with years of hard time under his belt. Moreover, prisons in antiquity were brutal. Prisoners had no rights. Most of the incarcerated population then, as today, were either poor people or dissidents. Apparently, Paul was both. Roman prisons, such as the one viewed here, were dark, damp, and foreboding subterranean structures. The Roman historian Sallust, writing about a century before Ephesians, described one Roman prison. Its appearance is disgusting and vile by reason of the filth, the darkness, and the stench. Prisoners who had been condemned to die either by strangulation or starvation were thrown into these dungeons. The phrase "to be cast into prison" may have its origins in ancient Rome. The writer now wonders somewhat rhetorically whether perhaps his audience might have heard about Paul's being locked up, which of course they would have, particularly if this is being written as a retrospective a few decades after Paul's execution by Rome. This may be slightly sarcastic. I assume you've already heard of the administration of God's grace given to me for you. Now, obviously, Paul, the historic Paul, was surely capable of sarcasm. In any case, it certainly introduces an edge to the epistle. This is intensified by the claim that the apostle's incarceration is specifically on behalf of the Gentile Christians to whom the epistle is being addressed. So I want to work a little bit further with the analogy to King's letter from Birmingham jail. King's jailings were also embarrassing to polite Southern Christians, and we can assume that the same was true for Paul's Gentile Christian compatriots. These jailings of the prophet served as unwelcome reminders that all was not well. that good people, ministers of the gospel, were being treated as criminals because of the problems that everyone really knew in their hearts truly existed. This, of course, was precisely the strategy that King had taken from Gandhi, using civil disobedience to provoke a moral crisis. I believe Paul is leaning on that same disruptive moral authority. So I like to think of Ephesians 3 as a sort of ancient letter from Birmingham City Jail, the famous contemporary epistle penned by King on April 16, 1963, during the darkest days of his struggle for integration and voting rights for African Americans. This letter, as you know, was addressed to 8 prominent Southern white Jewish and Christian clergymen who had published an opinion in the Birmingham paper opposing King's activism. In that letter, King responds to the minister's charges that he was an outside agitator, and he appeals to the example of none other than the Apostle Paul. I'm in Birmingham because injustice is here. Just as the prophets of the 8th century BC left their villages and carried their "Thus saith the Lord" far beyond the boundaries of their home villages. And just as the Apostle Paul left his village of Tarsus and carried the gospel of Jesus Christ to the far corners of the Greco-Roman world, so I am compelled to carry the gospel of freedom beyond my own hometown. Like Paul, I must constantly respond to the Macedonian call for aid. King then adds his famous and magnificent assertion: injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Clearly, King understood Paul's vision of profound social solidarity as the key to peacemaking. Now, Paul and King both knew that their dominant culture audiences, to which they addressed their carefully crafted epistles, for Paul, Gentile Christians, that is, Roman citizens, and for King, white Southern church leaders, they knew these folks were taking comfortable refuge in their ethnic and class privilege, hiding behind pious rhetoric while avoiding real solidarity with their oppressed cousins in the faith. Remember, Paul was Jewish. He was an oppressed minority in the Roman Empire, and he's the one in jail. King, African American, oppressed minority, he's the one in jail. And they're appealing to the dominant culture. So these writers challenge their Christian colleagues to fully embrace both the gospel and their responsibilities in this historical moment. And they do so from the jails of the system that they are seeking to overturn. King defends his use of civil disobedience in explicitly biblical terms. Of course, there's nothing new about this kind of civil disobedience, he says in the letter from Birmingham City Jail. It was evidenced sublimely in the refusal of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to obey the laws of Nebuchadnezzar on the ground that a higher moral law was at stake. And it was practiced superbly by the early Christians who were willing to face hungry lions and the excruciating pain of chopping blocks rather than submit to certain unjust laws of the Roman Empire. Not least, we might add, the Apostle Paul. So here are Paul and King, members of oppressed and marginalized minorities, appealing directly to members of the church who, as part of the majority culture, were in fact also their historic adversaries, socially and politically speaking. Both Paul and King are defending their witness and appealing to their adversaries for solidarity. It's an amazing thing to read this epistle through the lens of the Birmingham letter. This is exactly what the author to the Ephesians was trying to do, to remind his Gentile colleagues of the moral authority of the Jewish founders of Christianity, while also appealing to them from jail to follow Christ by refusing to cooperate with the institutionalized segregation that persistently kept Jews and Gentiles separate and unequal. The radical message of these letters and the disturbing social location of the letter writers are challenging to comfortable audiences then and now. That's why in the next two verses in Ephesians 3, Paul returns to the emphasis on the mystery that has been revealed to Paul as an apostle and prophet. And you see now that he is an administrator of this mystery, just as Christ is the administrator of the vision. You see these words highlighted here. There's another term here that's very interesting in verse 3, and that's apocalypsis. Because this vision that's being advanced is not obvious to the dominant culture. It requires another way of seeing. And that's what biblically apocalypse means. It's a double unmasking, as we see in the writing of another famous political prisoner, the revelation to John of Patmos. On one hand, the realities of injustice are being exposed. On the other hand, the possibilities of a different way of being are being glimpsed. Note again in verse 9 that Paul has taken over the administration of this mystery, a mystery that's not perfectly obvious to the dominant culture, and yet is being revealed from below, from oppressed minorities in jail. Paul then goes on to describe the central goal of his ministry. Astonishingly, it is not to build big churches, it's not to convert souls, but to animate the church, to make known this wisdom of God. There's that Lady Wisdom again, that Sophia tou Theou, in its rich diversity, to the rulers and the authorities in the highest places. It is this phrase that sets Paul's vocation and this whole epistle firmly in a political context. Paul is in jail because he is an evangelist for the gospel of peace in a world of hostility and division. And that includes proclaiming it to the highest authorities. That is, to the very people and institutions that are the architects of social enmity. And of course, Martin Luther King understood this perfectly 2 millennia later. He knew that systems would never change unless there were a public and inconvenient proclamation of the gospel of reunifying alienated human beings. Now, this business of principalities and powers brings to mind beloved Walter Wink. And as most of you know, earlier this year, Walter passed over into the cloud of witnesses. Perhaps more than any theologian in modern time, he helped us understand the political character of principalities and powers language in the New Testament, helping us to understand that these rulers in heavenly places were the spiritual counterparts of earthly authorities, the spirit of domination, we might say. In other words, when we're reading principalities and powers language, we are encountering highly political language. The Ephesian vision, therefore, is of the unavoidably public vocation of the church, and it could not be clearer. Yet we still imagine that our churches should stay out of politics, as if that were possible. The question is never whether the church should be political, only what kind of politics the church should embody. That's what Archbishop Oscar Romero learned when he began to speak out on behalf of the poor in El Salvador in the 1980s. It's what inspired Cesar Chavez, who was inspired by the witness of Dr. King, who came to understand his public vocation and often took the symbols of his deep Catholic faith into his public struggle on behalf of farm workers. It's what animated Presbyterian laywoman from Guatemala, Julia Esquivel, a celebrated poet and activist who was exiled from her home for many years because of her outspoken advocacy for human rights. And also the famous Dorothy Day, co-founder of the Catholic Worker Movement, who was arrested many times for civil disobedience. All these witnesses begin to help us understand what this epistle means by proclaiming the gospel to the powers. Christians who abide in this unilateral disarmament of the church cannot, by definition, also cooperate with the myriad of social constructions of enmity, whether gender, class, race, nation, sexual orientation, or any other way that we keep people out. Or as the goal of the Christian Peacemaker teams puts it, we seek to reduce violence by getting in the way. What would happen, asks CPT, if Christians devoted the same discipline and self-sacrifice to nonviolent peacemaking that armies do to war? And not least, Catholic Sister Dorothy Satang, who was martyred in 2005 in Brazil for her solidarity with peasants and her opposition to the way in which wealthy ranchers were illegally logging the rainforests. Christian disciples like these understand that the Ephesian call makes us have to rethink some of our most fundamental assumptions about our identities and our discipleship. In their jail epistles, both Dr. King and the Apostle Paul emphasize that members of the dominant group that has for so long oppressed their people have been welcomed into the covenant as full members because of the redemptive work of Christ. This is an incredible claim for a marginalized, hard-pressed group to open its doors to its oppressor group. But this kind of restorative justice, this kind of moral initiative, is politically counterintuitive and incredibly demanding. So we can understand why the author of Ephesians repeatedly emphasizes how this kind of unexpected transforming energy is ultimately a gift of divine grace. Of this gospel I was made servant, writes the author, according to the gift of God's grace, given to me according to the energy, energeon in Greek, of his power. It makes clear that nonviolent witness must be empowered by God's Spirit to do this kind of work. It was this energy that animated thousands of students to participate in the great sit-in movement in 1960 to protest segregation, and so many other mass movements since. In light of this sobering task, it's no accident that the author of Ephesians concludes his meditation on the church and the powers with a long pastoral prayer. He's praying for the very Gentile Christians who aren't too sure about the appropriateness of his witness. This text, chapter 3, verses 14 to 21, is the official epistle for July 29th, a week and a half from now. The author prays, with perhaps a hint of irony, that his audience will not lose heart over my suffering, which is redefined as their glory. The text goes on to emphasize that Paul prays that they will be strengthened in the deepest part of them, verse 16, and that they will trust in the power of the one who is able to do far more than anything we might ask or think, verse 20. In other words, Paul is trying to kickstart the political imagination of these domesticated Christians, hoping that these colleagues will become true partners in the faith, including in his political marginalization. Similarly, Dr. King ended his letter from Birmingham jail with a prayer for the people who had denounced him. I hope this letter finds you strong in the faith, he writes. I also hope that circumstances will soon make it possible for me to meet each of you, not as an integrationist, but as a fellow Christian brother. Let us hope that dark clouds of racial prejudice will soon pass away, and the deep fog of misunderstanding lifted from our fear-drenched communities. And in some not too distant tomorrow, the radiant stars of love and brotherhood will shine over our great nation. You can just see King heaping burning coals on the heads of the white clergy of Birmingham in his hospitable prayer. And indeed, prayer, both public and private, was the backbone of the civil rights movement. And so should it too be the backbone of our peacemaking work as well. Paul's epistle as a whole will close with a similar prayer and petition for solidarity. The political prisoner Paul asks in Ephesians 6:19 and 20 for courage to continue to speak truth to power. Pray also for me, so that when I speak, a message may be given to me to make known with boldness the mystery of the gospel. Now, by the end of the epistle, we understand that the mystery of the gospel is a technical phrase for the social project of overcoming alienation here and now. The project for which, he writes, I am an ambassador in chains. Pray that I may declare it boldly, as is necessary. Of course, it takes boldness because there's a cost to speaking this sort of truth. This notion of being an ambassador in chains echoes Paul's words in 2 Corinthians 5:20, a meditation from the historical Paul about the ministry of reconciliation as an imperative of grace. The writer here is clear that this message must be spoken boldly because it will not be warmly received by those in authority. I'm just going to take a pause and encourage all of you to stand up and stretch for 30 seconds, and then we'll get through the last piece of this presentation. We're about 70% of the way through. So just take a stretch. I'm going to do the same. Now's a good time for a pee break if anybody has to do that. You don't have to text us. That's what you're doing. Some of you might indicate to Charlita how it's going, whether you can still hear and see okay. Just talk back to us a little bit. I also want to say at this point, if you're gathering questions, you might want to start laying them into the chat function, and Charlita will try to keep track of those. So this is a good time to start putting some things on the table. And let me move now to the last piece and the last 3 weeks in which this epistle will be read. Ephesians 4 and 5. Here you see the texts on August 5th, 12th, and 19th. We get the first half of Ephesians 4. We get a little bit of the end of Ephesians 4 and beginning of 5. And then we get August 19th. We get a rather random outtake from Ephesians 5. So I'm going to just try to briefly overview the logic of what I like to call the catechism of personal and political nonviolence in Ephesians, in these chapters of Ephesians. The second half of the epistle begins with a simple word, therefore, which, as our English teachers always taught us, instructs us to search what it's there for. This is a powerful particle of speech in the Pauline tradition because it signals a shift away from the theological indicative, that is, this is what Christ has done for us, to the ethical imperative. This is, therefore, what we are called to be and do. Here again, the writer emphasizes Paul's social location. As a prisoner of empire, this makes his appeal so much more poignant. Paul has done his part. Now he is challenging and inviting communities of faith to live into their peacemaking vocation. And all of us who have been mentored by people like Daniel Berrigan and others who have done jail time in service of peace, Steve Clemens, who's on this call, who just recently got out of jail, they call us to be deeper peacemakers. Verses 4 and following in Ephesians 4 emphasize the personal, communal, and political disciplines of unity, noting the oneness of God in traditional Jewish fashion in verse 7, if you're following along in your text. Then the author switches to talk about diversity within that unity, which is a key notion in nonviolent community. The author stresses the various gifts and roles within the movement, all of which are gifts to be shared, not possessions to be used for self-advancement. So this is a very circular model of community, not hierarchical, with everyone striving to build up the whole. Unity and diversity. The goal of all of this, as stated in 14 to 16, is a deeply personal and political maturity. The author understands that many voices compete for our hearts and minds. We must no longer be children, tossed to and fro and blown about by every wind of doctrine, by people's trickery, by craftiness and deceitful scheming. One immediately thinks of Madison Avenue. But in speaking the truth in love, we must grow up in every way into Christ, the kaphia, to whom the whole body is joined. The point is to resist the seduction and the mind control of the dominant culture and to concentrate on growing up into Christ, which means growing into that organic body that is the church revealed in chapter 2, the peacemaking church. Here again is the emphasis on each part of the body cooperating. It's really amazing to find this sort of radically egalitarian rhetoric in these ancient texts. And it testifies to the enduring human quest to find the power to embody peaceable human community. But the writer's speaking the truth in love takes a sudden turn in verse 16. Again, we see the realism of Ephesians. It speaks about the vision of unity on one hand, and yet is frank about the forces of corruption, injustice, and depravity on the other hand, that were indeed embedded in the imperial culture of the ancient Roman Empire. Our situation in capitalist culture is scarcely different, and we would do well to take these strong warnings to heart. I insist on this in the Lord, says the writer. He couldn't have stronger language. No longer live as the Gentiles live in the futility of their minds. So, in one minute, he's embracing the other, and the next moment, he's very realistically showing that in the real world, there's all sorts of people who are hell-bent on destroying this vision. The ignorance, the hardness of heart, the lack of sensitivity, the abandonment to every kind of self-gratification and greed. These are the things that we really are up against in the real world. So on one hand, we're embracing alienated groups. On the other hand, we are very realistic about the predatory power of the dominant culture. Calvin Klein, in other words, does not speak the truth. And yet such messages are beamed at us 24/7. The point here is the classic Pauline one, stated famously in Romans 12:1, do not be conformed to the ways of the dominant culture, but be transformed inwardly and outwardly by Christ. This journey is intrinsic to the peacemaking vocation. The second half of Ephesians 4 takes on a baptismal rhetoric. This is not what you learned in Christ, assuming you have heard of his way of life. Once again, you get that little edge in Ephesians. Remember when he said, assuming you've heard that I'm in jail? The author isn't really sure whether or not these Gentile Christians are actually wanting to be disciples. So he exhorts them in baptismal language, put on the new human nature, which is truly created after the likeness of God in justice and holiness. The rhetoric of to put on or to take off was both a literal reference to the idea of, ancient early Christians would be baptized naked. They'd take off all their clothes, they'd go down into the waters, and they'd put on a new garment, usually a white garment. So literally the taking off of the old clothes, the putting on of the new clothes is a central metaphor throughout the epistolary tradition of the commitments that we take in baptism. And of course, if we remember our baptismal vows, they're all about renunciation as well as embrace. And you see that same dialectic happening here in Ephesians 4. And finally, the last part of Ephesians 4, this is the part that does come up on August 12th. You get this putting away falsehood, speaking the truth, being members of one another. Be angry, but do not sin. Do not let the sun go down on your anger. These are practical advices for nonviolent living, emphasizing truth and reconciliation. There is a space for anger. There are things to be angry at. It's righteous indignation. but it's also important not to allow what modern psychologists talk about, the way that anger, righteous anger, can quickly deteriorate into sheer rage, which introjects on us in a negative way and also gets projected out on others in a negative way. And here's an interesting little practical part of the practical advice. Thieves must give up stealing, let rather them labor and work honestly with their own hands, so as to have something to share with the needy. This is an interesting little insight into the early church. Not only are you supposed to support yourself, you're also supposed to help. Everybody's supposed to be part of redistributing the wealth to the poor. That raises an interesting question. What would it mean for us today to make honest livings that are not predicated upon the theft of the resources and the labor of others? We could spend a whole webinar just on that one verse. And then at the culmination of Ephesians 4, forgive one another as God in Christ forgave you. So what we see here is the dialectic of truth and reconciliation. Of course, that immediately brings to mind the great experiments with truth and reconciliation in South Africa, the motto of the TRC, no healing without truth, no future without forgiveness. And that gives me another wonderful opportunity to shamelessly promote our next Bartimaeus Institute. We just got through having a fabulous permaculture institute here week before last, was it? Last week? Whenever?
July.
And our next one coming up is going to be in November 9th to 12th, and it's going to be precisely on restorative justice as truth and reconciliation work. This Veterans Day long weekend institute will focus on how restorative justice might be applied in the work of healing historic injustices. We're going to focus on two current North American experiments, the local Greensboro Truth and Community Reconciliation Project, which still seeks to heal from a 1979 Klan massacre of labor organizers, and the National Canadian TRC Commission, which is addressing the Indian residential schools legacy. So we hope that you'll help us publicize and promote this, and that a few of you might head out for what I think promises to be a great institute. This will be our third institute of 2012, so we hope you can join us. Now, August 19th's lection dips into Ephesians 5, but does so rather unevenly. And so I want to just again highlight a few very, very important parts of the argument, the continuing meditation on nonviolent living that we see in Ephesians 5. There's a continuing series of exhortations. Verses 1 through 5 focus on imitating God and refusing to conform to practices of deception, exploitation, and falsehood. Ephesians then stipulates two strategies for living against the grain of culture. On one hand, Christians are to non-cooperate with evil. Not only are we to dissociate with the children of darkness in verse 7, but we are to refuse to take part in institutional injustices. Try to learn what is pleasing to the Lord and take no part in unfruitful works of darkness. Verses 10 and following. This brings to mind friends such as Randy Keeler and Betsy Corner in Massachusetts, who are some of the longest standing war tax resistors in our generation, who have gone to great lengths to non-cooperate with the IRS in their witness to peacemaking, to refuse to allow their dollars to pay for war. But beyond such defensive measures, we are also exhorted to take offensive measures by exposing violence and corruption. And here, of course, we think of the Plowshares movement that began in 1980 and now has had dozens of actions all over the world. Instead, we not only non-cooperate with evil, but we expose it. It is shameful even to mention what is done in secret, but everything exposed by the light becomes visible. So think of Plowshares activists going into top high security areas and exposing the bombs that are there. Or the work of WikiLeaks, which Charlita is reminding me. Another attempt to try to expose what's happening in our national security state. Now, inexplicably, the lectionary only includes Ephesians 5:15 to 20, and so again, I encourage you to use some of these texts as well if you're preaching. And I know, Weldon, you're going to have to leave here in a minute, but my favorite text in Ephesians 5 is verse 19. Be filled with the Spirit as you sing psalms and hymns and spiritual songs among yourselves, singing and making melody to the Lord in your hearts. And if we were more on top of the technology, we'd cut into Sweet Honey in the Rock singing, we who believe in freedom shall not rest. But clearly the civil rights movement, singing in jail, in the streets, was key, and that's still true for us today. Song is key to movement building, and I love the fact that it is highlighted in the book of Ephesians. Speaking of omissions, I'm going to make one myself right now. It's also not included in the lectionary. And because of time, but also because this is a very complex issue, I'm going to skip over the notorious household codes in which wives, children, and slaves are all called to be subordinate to one another. I just want to bracket that. It's a whole issue and conundrum in and of itself, and one of these times we'll do a whole webinar on it, because there's more to this than maybe you've heard. There are ways to handle this text that I believe are redemptive and not just retrograde. But in the meantime, people like Focus on the Family love these texts. And I like the reminder of the P-flag folk, our family is fine, focus on your own. But we'll just bracket the household code for now, knowing that that's a much longer conversation and would take a much longer time than we have. So I hope you'll flag that, P-flag that for another time. Now we're into the home stretch, the final section of Ephesians, which catalogs an arsenal of nonviolent weapons of resistance. And this is the last text in our series of 7 weeks on August 26th, this Ephesians 6:10 through 20. We have to ask, do the unabashedly military metaphors of this section of Ephesians contradict the peaceable tone of the rest of the epistle? And I guess I would say this is only the case in the theological tradition of American pietism, which has mishandled these texts just as it has mishandled the household codes. The tendency is to spiritualize the metaphors of God's armor, taking them far out of the realm of politics or even conflict and driving them inward. Or another error is to see Ephesians 6:10 as the precise protocol for spiritual warfare, or worse, to believe these metaphors provide tacit or explicit justification for Christian participation in war. And believe me, there are many posters out there, whether it's George Washington kneeling in prayer or GIs in Iraq kneeling in prayer, that quote these texts. I believe this is a call to spiritual warfare, but we need to get this right. These traditions are not wrong in imagining a spiritual warfare, but they have missed the point by removing the text from the broader narrative of Ephesians, which is about the abolition of enmity. Because peace is defined as social reconciliation in a world of hostility, and because the church is called to speak truth to the powers, it stands to reason that disciples must learn the art of nonviolent resistance. Ephesians' military images function rhetorically in 2 ways. One is shock value. They disabuse us of the notion that there are polite transfers of power in the real world, or that justice trickles down, or that if we just present a rational proposal with proper diplomacy, the powers will work with us. Such are fantasies of middle-class politicians and liberal social reformers. But the poor know better, and so does the Bible. Transformation involves intense struggle. The only question is what kind of weaponry we wield. The logic of Ephesians 6:10 10 and following, is precisely that whoever would remain in the peace of Christ must be prepared to wage the kind of satyagraha with the forces of violence and oppression in the world. The other rhetorical flourish here is that we're actually getting a midrash on Isaiah 59, where the divine warrior Yahweh goes to battle against a people which has forsaken the ways of peace and justice. You see the text here. Their deeds are sinful. They commit violent crimes, eager to shed blood. They're unfamiliar with peace. Their deeds are unjust. They use deceitful methods. In Greek, the methodai that appears in verse 10 in Ephesians. That oracle goes on to say that God sees that there's no advocate and is shocked that no one intervenes, and so takes matters into her own hands. God's desire for justice drives her. She wears it like body armor. The desire to deliver it is like a helmet on God's head. God puts on the garments of vengeance, wears zeal like a robe. So it's very clear that Ephesians 6 is sort of recontextualizing Isaiah's notion of God, the warrior, prepared for battle. And here, in conclusion, are some of the elements of the nonviolent warrior. We see a string of verbs in the imperative mood commending us to be empowered. In verse 10, in the strength of God's might. Another reminder that we need the divine force more powerful to contend with the brute force of the domination system. This was a core conviction of Gandhi's, who said, the only weapon of the satyagrahi is God. Without God, the satyagrahi is devoid of strength before an opponent armed with monstrous weapons. Most people lie prostrate at such physical might. But the one who accepts God as protector will remain unbent before the mightiest earthly power. Nonviolence, in other words, is not passivism, as it is so often mischaracterized, but an alternative form of potent engagement. Ephesians Catechism gets the troops ready for battle. Again, however, it's not an individual soldier being equipped, but a community of resistance. The verbs are still in the second person plural. Once more, we encounter the baptismal language of putting on the whole armor of God. Nothing less will enable us to withstand the tactics, the methodai of the devil. Those committed to restorative justice and peacemaking are forever struggling with the seductive logic of domination, especially with the temptation to sacrifice the opponent in order to win, or the pressure to join the armed cause of one's kinfolk. The author stipulates at the outset that this is a struggle. The term here, pale, is the only time that this appears in the New Testament. The word connotes a wrestling, the most intimate form of adversarial combat. And yet the author immediately clarifies that this hand-to-hand combat is not ultimately against enemies of blood and flesh, but against those principalities and powers, against the world rulers of this present darkness. This represents a sort of taxonomy of the domination system, which is the protracted struggle between God and the powers throughout history. So that's what the first couple of verses tell us. It's a specific rejection of the summons to the final eschatological battle advocated, for example, in the Qumran scrolls. And we might add that is promoted by modern Christian millennialists and holy warriors, including the religious ideologues of the latter Bush administration. Instead, this exhortation is about standing one's ground, being centered, and maintaining equilibrium in the face of the propaganda of redemptive violence. Rationalizations for retribution are always rooted in the worst-case scenarios. But in light of Christ's peacemaking work on the cross, Ephesians calls for resistance to enmity itself, the ideology of alienation that is wrought by oppressive power and that is spread through systems, technologies, and worldviews of superiority and domination. So we should not over-personalize the struggle, imagining that the problem is defined by Saddam Hussein or George Bush. Nor should we depersonalize our adversaries, for they are also part of the beloved community. But it's surely sobering to realize that peacemakers are in fact taking on this entire cosmology of institutional and ideological hostility. For a second time, we are told to take up the whole armor, now not as clothing but as defensive instruments in verse 13. There's a keen emphasis on standing against and standing, battlefield metaphors used by Roman foot soldiers, whether you stand or fall in combat. And now we come to the elements of divine armor. In verse 14, the belt of truth resonates with Gandhi's conviction that at the core of nonviolence is satyagraha, experiments in truth. This verse in Ephesians is an allusion to the Septuagint version of Isaiah 11, which is part of the great Stump of Jesse oracle. There we're told that with justice God's representative will judge the poor and decide with equity for the meek of the earth. The breastplate of justice in verse 2, the second half of verse 14, and the helmet of salvation invokes Isaiah 59:17. But the prophet's reference to vengeance is omitted by Ephesians. And finally, footwear is the readiness to proclaim the good news of peace in verse 15. Another allusion to Isaiah. How welcome on the mountain are the feet of the one heralding peace. Isaiah 52:7. This oracle refers to the duty of the noble warrior to know when to cease struggle and to come to the negotiating table. In the social context of the Roman Empire, official message runners would have carried declarations of a ceasefire directly into the field of battle. But according to Ephesians, Christ has already declared peace unilaterally on the cross. And besides all these, says the writer in verse 16, we must take up the shield of faith to quench all the flaming arrows of the evil one. This time the allusion is to Psalm 91. God's faithfulness is a shield. While the defensive aspect is obvious, Roman centurions also used shields to advance against archery assaults in laying siege to cities. Thus, the metaphor has offensive connotations as well. The image can be a call to use our disarmed bodies to intervene between hostile parties, or to paraphrase the Christian Peacemaker slogan, to get in the way of violence. The image of the grasping the helmet of salvation places the church on the church the task of bringing liberation to those in bondage by imitating the God of Isaiah 59. One might think here by way of analogy of the UN peacekeeping forces as violence reduction strategy, referred to around the world as the blue helmets. Again, CPT's exhortation. What would it mean for Christians to have the same kind of commitment as a peace army that was also a vision of Gandhi's? And at last, taking up the sword of the Spirit, which is the Word of God. This is a metaphor that comes up in 2 Corinthians, Hebrews, and Revelation. Even as we nonviolently resist with our bodies, we must use the power of the Word to persuade our opponents. Dr. King was the consummate example of an orator's ability and responsibility as a constituent part of the overall struggle to win hearts and minds, not with weapons made of metal, but of rhetorical swords. So that's the task of making our case. Well, that's a very intense survey of the book of Ephesians. And those of you who are interested in doing more work, I want to make one recommendation. There are lots of commentaries out on Ephesians, and Marcus Bart, who I mentioned earlier, would be an older source. But I think the most helpful and comprehensive commentary on Ephesians was published just a few years ago by friend and colleague Tom Yoder Neufeld, who is just retiring now from Conrad Grebel College in Winnipeg. Tom's a great guy, very supportive of peacemaking around the world. He is himself a Mennonite, and actually is married to John Howard Yoder's daughter. So they're quite a peacemaking family, and his book in the Believer's Church Bible Commentary series, Ephesians, is really a great piece of work if you want to get into detail and see some of the debates in interpretation over Ephesians. Thanks, Donna, for hanging in there on the library computer. That's good work. I want to close my comments there. We're just about out of time, but since we started a little late, we'll open up a little time in case there are some questions. Charlita, have we had anybody have some things on tap? I haven't been noting it. Angie Ford says, do you have any suggestions for beginning to tear down the dividing wall between the rich and poor in this country? The plight of the poor is worsening, and the rich jeer and blame them. Thank you, Angie. That's a huge issue, and it is one that we try to take seriously here at BCM through our Sabbath economics work. So if you're not already familiar with some of our Sabbath economics publications and our DVD, you can go to the chedmyers.org site and look at those. That is perhaps the greatest wall of all, and one that we absolutely need to be working on as disciples, as individuals, as families, and as churches. See, Steve Clevens, Charlie, was that the only one outstanding? Okay, thanks. Do we know if any of the clergy of the Birmingham letter addressed ever joined the movement later, such as at Selma? Steve, that's a great question. And I know there was the Episcopal bishop later came around. He was one of the people addressed in that letter, and he later came around, but sort of after the parade had passed. To my knowledge, none of the other ones addressed, of the 8 addressed in that letter, came around, but I could be wrong. That would be something to check in Taylor Branch's voluminous history of the civil rights movement. Although Elaine and I recently read through that volume that details the Birmingham campaign, and I don't recall him saying anything about that question. That's a great question. Obviously, there were lots of clergy, as you point out, Steve, who were very involved in the movement. We've got time for maybe 1 or 2 comments or questions, and then we'll shut it down. I don't know about where you are, but here in Oakview, it's hot, 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 and there's 4 of us jammed in this tiny little office, and we are sweating. We really appreciate you hanging in here on this webinar. Again, apologies for the formatting of a number of the slides. That was very frustrating to us, but this is our first time on as a subscriber to Adobe Connect. I think those of you who are veterans of earlier webinars hopefully will agree that this is a better platform. And we also thank you, Marcia. Bless you too, my sister, up there on Whidbey Island. We hope to expand the number of people who can participate by the next webinar. And maybe I'll take a minute to plug the next webinar, which is going to be a free webinar. It's on August 16th, which is also a Thursday evening. Please note the different starting time. That's at 5 p.m., about a month from now. And the topic is going to be the relationship between the Hiroshima and Nagasaki Day commemorations, August 6th and 9th. The correlation between those commemorations and the traditional church feast of the Transfiguration on August 9th, and the ways that those correlate with the life and witness of our mentor, LaDon Sheets. It's going to be a free community webinar, and we're going to have a number of colleagues and friends of LaDon's from around the country to talk about his life. Some of you may know LaDon, some of you may not, but I highly commend this opportunity to hear about one of the great peacemakers of the last generation, who was a dear friend and whom several of us helped cross over in a community hospice effort 10 years ago. So we're commemorating the 10th anniversary of his death and of that hospice effort, and the 30th anniversary of my trip to Hiroshima and Nagasaki in this free community webinar. So tune in, if you will, and spread the word. We're going to hopefully try to get a bunch of people on. Donna is asking about the household code references. Again, this piece by Tom Yoder Neufeld, this commentary, is one of the better discussions. He gets into the complexity of different ways of looking at that text. He looks at some of the dysfunctional ways of looking at it. And he also broaches the question of whether we can redeem these texts to talk about a true ethic of mutual subordination. That's an issue I'm very, very interested in, and it is germane to nonviolence as a way of life. That is, learning ways of relating one to another in mutual subordination. It is the ultimate attack on any form of hierarchy. But unfortunately, it's been the notion of mutual subordination has long been poisoned by toxic Christian hierarchies, and particularly patriarchy and white supremacy in the bloody history of Christendom. So we have a lot to do to try to reclaim that text. So thank you. Steve will get out those invites. It is posted on our jedmyers.org site, I believe now. It just was posted up today. And we'll send out reminders. We're really looking forward to this. And Steve, we're hoping you'll be one of the people to give some input on the life and witness of LaDon. Hyun, greetings, and we're really glad that Hyun is in Southern California and is a faithful participant in these webinars. And of course, he's asking the very tricky question of the conflict between North and South Korea. And Hyun, I think that's your job to give us some perspective on that. I do think this is profoundly relevant. I just say one thing, Hyun. I don't know if you know the work of Don Mosley. Don Mosley was a disciple of Clarence Jordan of Koinonia Farm fame in Georgia. And Don and his wife and friends have been a part of Jubilee Partners community in Comer, Georgia, for the last number of decades. I think that community was founded in the mid-70s. But in the last years, Hyun, Don has taken to doing sort of unofficial civilian diplomacy into North Korea. He's been working with the Carter Center, which of course got some press a while back for some of their work with North Korea. But Don is doing unauthorized Christian diplomacy in North Carolina. He's been working with Habitat for Humanity, trying to take some material aid into North Korea and to meet with people there. And so you might be very, very interested in some of those sorts of efforts by Don Mosley. And if you email me, Hyun, I'd be happy to give you those contacts. Meantime, of course, there's peace movements on the ground in South Korea that we hear a little bit about, and in North Korea that we don't hear anything about. So Hyun, we'll look forward to you educating us further on what, in fact, Ephesians does mean. Thank you, Steve, for that correction. Don is working with the Fuller Center for Housing in North Korea. That's a little bit of a political correction there. Thank you. We've got a little bit of time for a few more comments. I know several of you are typing furiously away. We really appreciate the feedback. Thank you, Hetty. We'll look forward to your input when we talk about LaDon next month. All right, Hyun, you already know Don. That's great. Excellent. You're ahead of the curve as usual, Brother Hyun. Charlita Erb, sitting here working with me on this webinar, is going to be meeting with you, Hyun, late next month?
Middle of August with the leadership team of the Peace Justice Support Network of the Mennonite Church USA.
So Hyun, your church is going to be hosting the Peace and Justice Support Network of the Mennonite Church. So Charlita is just indicating that she's looking forward to coming down there and being with you. Jonathan Cornford has been on this webinar from Australia, and we especially want to give him a shout out. Jonathan does Sabbath economics type work down there in Australia, that he's adopted some of our work for the Australian context. And he's noting that John Howard Yoder's chapter on revolutionary subordination and the politics of Jesus was one of the first attempts to push back on the conventional wisdom that these were retrograde texts only interested in the oppression of women and slaves. And he's pointing to a classic attempt by John Howard in that classic book, Politics of Jesus. Thanks for that reminder. And that's that piece is something that Tom Yoder Neufeld takes into account in his conversation around this. All right, friends, I think without further ado, we're going to shut this down. This webinar was recorded, and we will follow up with an email in, probably realistically early next week to tell you how to access this webinar. Then we'll get it. We've been very slow in posting past webinars as products on the chedmyers.org site, and that's because we've been shorthanded. But we now have the wonderful Charlita Erb and Tim Nafziger here, who are techies who are going to help us catch up to speed. I also want to mention that we're enjoying the company of Rachel Hudgens, who is our summer intern with us for a month from Reba Place Fellowship. So we've got 3 Chicagoans with us here in Oakview, and really delighting in that. Thanks, Jonathan, for joining us. It's on YouTube. All right. For those of you who have stuck on to this point, don't log off, because Charlita is about to make a post in the chat that's going to give you a link to a special preview of an awesome time-lapse video of the painting of the Bartimaeus Institute wall mural that happened 2 weeks ago. And in a minute, that link is coming up. There it is. Check it out. It's amazing. This is the wonderful work of Albuquerque-based artist Dmitry Kadyev, who worked for 10 days with lots of community help to put up an amazing mural that tells the story of Elaine's relatives, who in many ways embodied the vision of Ephesians during the Russian Revolution in Ukraine. So we will have the occasion to tell the story of that mural at some length in a future webinar, but for now, Tim took a great time-lapse video of it, and the world debut now is being posted at this link. So those of you who have hung on till now, check out that link. I'm going to give you 1 more minute to copy and paste that link into your own browser, and we're going to sign off. I'm going to leave this page up for a few minutes. I'm going to sign off because I'm losing my voice and everybody in here is sweating. Thank you very much for participating.